Hello, and welcome to the Sensual Soul Project, out of righteous religion and into the sensual soul. I'm your host, Julia Bryan. I'm a registered nurse, singer-songwriter, EFT tapping practitioner, and ex-missionary. This podcast is about life beyond religion. It's about asking the hard questions, exploring the infinite shades of gray, and leaning into our ability to hold paradox, embracing the both and versus the either or of fundamentalism. In order to understand what led me on this path, I started from the very beginning in episode 1, The Making of a Missionary. In part 2, I will be sharing the stories that led me to Uganda and the journey of emotional and spiritual abuse that ensued. I labored over my decision to use pseudonyms in this podcast. Ultimately, this is my story, and its purpose is not to vilify individuals, but to shed light onto a system that enables abuses of power and erodes accountability. Between obedience and awakening. God, harden me against myself, this coward with pathetic voice who craves for ease and rest and joy. Myself, arch traitor to myself, my hollowest friend, my deadliest foe, my clog, whatever road I go. Christina Rossetti. Those words became the banner over my life at 18. They named the war I would fight for years, against my body, against my longing, against the voice of my tender heart. But before all that, I swear I heard the call. The summer after high school, I went on my very first missions trip with my youth group to the lush, beautiful Caribbean island of Grenada. Our church had missionary contacts there who hosted us. They took us into schools and prisons to share our testimonies, to sing, to pray, to sit with people. We helped run a summer Bible school for children, taught songs and Bible stories. I'll never forget leading song in a prison. Behind the bars, voices rising, something cracked open in me. That night I wrote in my journal, "My heart has finally been set on fire for missions, and I know this is my call. This is my life. This is the only thing that makes sense." I wanted to serve humanity, to live for more than myself. Suddenly, all those nights I'd spent on the roof of my girlhood bedroom, gazing at the stars and bawling over the weight of human suffering, they made sense. I thought, this is why I feel so much. This is why I ache. I was born to make a difference. So when I entered 24/7 Leadership Academy, it all seemed perfectly aligned. A few months after proving ourselves in missions training and in the Eco Challenge, we spent an entire month traveling through Mexico in a convoy of 15 passenger vans. We had 3 youth in the program who were from Mexico, so we had a lot of contacts with main churches and a constellation of villages and towns with smaller churches to visit. We helped paint and clean up, did construction and repair, any project they needed. Then we would perform at their church services. We joined in on the youth group meetings where we worshipped and danced with the youth, and then performed our skits in full mime makeup. One of the churches we served had the whole congregation line up to hug us. I felt as high as a kite leaving that place. At a large church in Monterey, we spent the night outside in the freezing cold at the site of the orphanage they were in the process of building. The idea was to bless and pray over the land. The mountains rising out of the edge of that valley in the misty morning gripped my soul as the pastor's wife shared her testimony. She told us, "When you can't get used to the sound of people treading their way to hell, you know you're a missionary." I took that to heart. Later in the trip, after ministering at an orphanage, all these little children under the age of 10 came up to the front just to get hugs and love from us. Many of them melted into our arms and cried. I held a little girl who bawled her eyes out in my arms for at least 20 minutes. I remember thinking I would never be the same. I felt such a fire to make a difference. I was, for the most part, fairly blind to the needs of my home country, all the injustices and hurting people there. It didn't occur to me, partly because of the privileged and insular worldview I grew up with, and partly because I felt I had been given this call. It was my destiny, my purpose, to live in other countries and reject any kind of easy or self-serving path. It was in my journal from this Mexico trip that I found the God hardened me against myself quote scribbled out the first time. I later painted it across my full-length mirror. It became my anthem. One of the things that touched me deeply in Mexico was a village church that lined up the whole congregation and sent us out in pairs to the homes of members for dinner. My friend and I went with an older couple to their little home where they fed us the most delicious meal, handmade tortillas. I spoke a little Spanish and we had the sweetest time together. We prayed for each other. And I remember thinking, there's nothing else I'd rather be doing than having this kind of connection with people. It was after we had spent the whole day cleaning up their church and compound and helping with repairs. Serving people felt right in my bones. I was convinced, this is it. Later that year, our second missions trip was to Papua New Guinea for 4 weeks and then a week in the Philippines. Same kinds of things, but more ministry focused. Skits, outreach, songs, testimonies. We each had opportunities to share, either in open air evangelism like a market or in a church service. I remember reflecting after that trip that I'd been ruined. I'd never be able to settle for a normal life. We flew on a tiny plane once we got into Papua New Guinea, up to the mountain villages with no roads, only hikes to reach the mission base, like Swiss Family Robinson huts in the jungle. We lived with the people, ate what they ate, ministered with them. Their hospitality, the gift-giving, was unlike anything I'd known. I came home with, I think, 13 woven bags they called bilams, meaning womb. They carry everything in these bags, even children, with a strap over the forehead so the load rests on the back. People with nothing gave a bilam in gratitude for us coming. I was so moved by their spirit of hospitality and gratitude, how we were taken in, by the children, the jungle, how they lived more attuned to the land and in reciprocity with it. At the time, I didn't fully recognize that we were bringing in a kind of Western colonialism. What I fell in love with was being with the people, learning their culture, eating with them, staying in their homes, preparing food, learning their customs. To be fair to 24/7, we were trained to come with deep respect, to value people and the way they live, to be self-aware, to never decline food or gifts, to be thankful for any accommodation or hospitality. I loved that deep experience of the people. In the Philippines, we took a 9-hour bus and then rode 2 hours in the bed of a truck up to the villages in the north. Our first stop was a remote Philippine military base. Picture this: a bamboo-walled mess hall with karaoke machine and a pool table surrounded by thick jungle. They handed me the microphone and I found myself singing John Denver's Leaving on a Jet Plane with a group of Filipino soldiers all grinning ear to ear. So surreal. I felt so alive connecting in that way. We stayed in a village in the valley below with host families. I recall a fish meal with vegetables cooked over the open fire that was just out of this world. The floors were bamboo, and the elderly woman I stayed with showed us the burn marks from World War II, when Japanese soldiers had invaded and her family was forced to house them. The village embraced us. We did our skits and had translators, and then the whole village invited us to participate in an evening of traditional dance. About 20 men playing gongs, and they dressed us in traditional garb and taught us these dances. A night of festivities, generosity, and hospitality I'll never forget. These experiences fanned the flame in my desire to live a life of adventure, connection, and service. What I believed then was true service. For to you it has been granted for Christ's sake not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. Philippines 1:29. I found etched in my missions journal. That, along with one of the 24/7 core values, quote, I will develop my spiritual relationship with God by taking the attitude of Christ and submitting to those in spiritual leadership over me, end quote. They drove this one into our heads, especially because some leaders were much younger than the students, and maturity gaps led to poor decisions. The message was, quell your doubts and submit, radical submission to the leadership God placed in your life. Part of our curriculum as female students in 24/7 was the 5 aspects of a woman, and they are as follows: daughter of the king, helper completer, sacred vessel of life, handmaiden of wisdom, and the glory of man. I did not enjoy these lessons. My notes include lines like, don't overstep the leadership of your man. A woman must respond to her husband. We were likened to the moon, with her husband as the sun, that we have no light of our own. Be content with our lot. We are the crown upon his head and complete his calling. A teacher said, the bait you use will catch the corresponding fish. If you're a whoremonger, dress like a whore. If you want a prince, conduct yourself like a princess. Given my upbringing and a year of having these things drilled in, I did my best to submit, but I couldn't get on board. A calling to missions became my way out of that life. I wouldn't sacrifice anything for what I perceived as the call of God to the mission field, even if it meant being alone. There was much consternation among us first-year students about whether to come back for a second year at 24/7 or go to college or apply for jobs in one of the church ministries at New Life. While others debated a second year, school, or jobs, I really didn't want to return. I wanted to go to the mission field or school to become a doctor. Sometime in the second half of the program, I was vacuuming the massive sanctuary with one of those backpack vacuums when I felt I heard a directive to apply for hospitality, the church's janitorial services, after graduating 24/7. To humble myself, to die to ego, not pursuing anything flashy like a second-year leadership position or youth group staff or worship team. An acquaintance who worked in hospitality told me, and this is a quote from my journal, if you're looking for death to self, hospitality is for you. It's hell a lot of the time. So I applied, with a plan to start in September after 2 months at home. And then I didn't get the job. I was confused, felt lost, wondering if I'd misheard, if I was outside of God's will, if I knew anything at all. After 2 months at home, I moved back to Colorado Springs into a house with 4 other girls from church and actually shared a room with one of them. I got a job as a barista, which I actually loved, and landed a position on the worship team for young adult service on Friday nights called The Mill, which I also loved. As a 24/7 alumni, I helped with retreats and missions training for the new first years. I asked God what to do. My journal listed options: join my cousin working on a ranch in New Zealand, apply to Azusa Pacific, a Christian university in California, for pre-med, or pursue a wrangler position at a dude ranch in Jackson Hole. Then a young man came to the mill to talk about a discipleship training program in Uganda for young adults ready to enter the mission field. He had served with youth with a mission and talked about how this program would be similar, a bridge into missions. And he was super tall and had gorgeous blue eyes, and I fantasized, maybe I can have it all, the mission field and a husband. At this point in the story, I want to include some quotes I had jotted down from sermons during that year. From a young adults retreat called Live, Love, Loud. Quote, unbalanced, wide-eyed radicals are the ones who will put their stamp on the world and stand before the throne and say, I have loved you with everything I had. End quote. Another sermon titled, No Reserves, No Retreat, No Regrets. Burn the ships you came in on. No retreats. If I falter, push me on. If I stumble, pick me up. If I retreat, shoot me. And another one. Make it hard to go to hell from your campus. Their blood is on your hands. And another. We're not here to be the nice guys. We're here to run to the battle line. At some point during this year, I became convinced that I needed deliverance from dark strongholds and demonic influences in my life. I ended up signing up for some deliverance conference, not entirely sure what I was in for. There was preaching and teaching for the first portion of the day, then the team set to work casting demons out of the people. I was nervous, but desperate to manage my feelings of attraction towards women and my sexual desires in general. I was 19. After the teaching, the chairs were removed from the room to make space for battle. 2 women began praying for me, and when I started quietly praying in my prayer language, one of them yelled in my face, "Shut up, devil!" She cast out the spirit of Jezebel, the third eye, and the other woman was physically batting at my groins, shouting, "Spirit of lust, out of the loins." I was standing there crying with my hands open to the sky while this carried on for quite some time. Other people were shouting, shaking, and throwing themselves around while being delivered of demons. And I could tell they were growing impatient with my lack of fanfare. Finally, an older gentleman came to my aid and called the women off, stating there is another approach. He guided me through a visualization of the Holy Father's unconditional love. And that was my experience of deliverance from my evil sexuality. This brings to mind another wacky situation that happened during Sunday's service. There are these people referred to as prayer warriors or intercessors, and some of them make quite a show of it during worship. In the front of our church, people would often dance and jump around and pray loudly in tongues, their own special prayer language. This woman sounded like she was barking, and I got an uncomfortable feeling, which I took to mean that I was supposed to ask her to pray for me. She obliged and did some more yelling in tongues and then put her foot behind my leg while pushing my head down to the ground. You see, there's this thing in the Pentecostal church called being slain in the spirit, when you supposedly lose consciousness because someone who's super powerful and anointed lays hands on you. I laid there on the ground wondering what just happened, feeling dubious, immediately followed by guilt and the thought that perhaps I was not spiritual enough to be slain in the spirit. What a sham. Back to what to do with my young life. So I applied to Azusa Pacific, contacted the ranch manager in Jackson Hole, and applied to the discipleship ministry in Uganda. I decided to put out a fleece, like Gideon in the Old Testament, pursue all 3, and go with the first to open because I felt I'd botched the hospitality calling. The discipleship ministry got back quickly. It was their pilot year under World Outreach Ministry Foundation based out of Seattle. The offshoot was founded in Colorado. Here's a little background on this new discipleship program. A man from Maryland Hickey Ministries had been partnering with World Outreach Ministry to do ministry in Uganda. I'll call him Gary. He saw young people arriving in Uganda without guidance and causing issues, so he proposed a young adults discipleship program and recruited Ryan, who was 30 and had youth with a mission experience living in Thailand, to be the director. Gary had his own ministry and identified himself as a prophet, and he and his wife hosted Bible studies and discipled young couples and young adults. One of those young couples, who I'll call Christy and Brandon, graduates of Maryland Hickey Bible School, were told by Gary that it was God's will for them to be assistant directors of this pilot discipleship program in Uganda for 5 to 6 months, leaving everything. They were 22, no missions or hands-on discipleship leadership experience. Christy had just landed a dream acting and modeling job on the East Coast. I didn't know any of this then. I just met the director, Ryan, and heard his passionate pitch, and it was missions in Africa. This was God calling me before school. So I laid school and the other adventures on the altar and said yes. A week later, I got a call from the ranch manager in Jackson Hole, but it was too late. I was committed. Before departure, I was ecstatic, finally aligned with God's call. While working at the coffee shop, I got my certified nurse aide license as a step toward healthcare. When my lease ended, I moved home, working at a nursing home to save for the trip, and cared for my grandmother for the last 2 months of her life. She passed before I left for Uganda. It was a whirlwind of grief, excitement, fear, anxiety, anticipation. I decided to shave my head before the trip. I figured lots of women in Africa have short hair, so my little brother and I shaved each other's heads a week before I left. I packed my bags, guitar, camping gear, journals, notebooks, and a variety of Bath and Body Works sprays, got on the plane across the Great Blue Sea. When we landed in Entebbe, the smell of the air hit me. It felt like home. I had a burning hole in my heart for Africa I couldn't describe, something I had felt since junior high. I had built it up in my heart as the place I was meant to be. We stepped out onto the tarmac, destiny in the air. Our leaders, Ryan, Christy, and Brandon, were shocked to see my shaved head. This was probably my first red flag. There were dress guidelines, but nothing about hair. Christy was upset I hadn't asked permission. To her, it was a big red flag that I'd be a rebel and a problem. Driving toward our village of Segaku, my heart buzzed. I was excited to finally be here, living with the people. But when we pulled up to our home, my heart sank. It was markedly nicer than the average home in the village, with plumbing, running water, heated even, and a modern gas stove and oven. I climbed to my top bunk and bawled my eyes out, because I hadn't come to live above the people. I wanted to live as they live, cooked as they cooked, eat what they ate. I was pretty devastated, because this didn't align with my training or my expectation. Christy later loved to poke fun of me about this. I pulled myself together and dove into our first meeting with the other students. There were 5 of us, plus Ryan, the director, and Christy and Brandon, the assistant directors. How to summarize that first stint? I loved the people, the hospitality, how time didn't exist, the community. I'd witnessed it on short-term trips, but over 5 months, I got to live in the community. We spent a lot of time in sermons, books, lectures by Ryan, Christy, and Brandon, plus scripture memorization, morning prayer, and community prayer in the church our mission partnered with. It was an open morning meeting for anyone to gather. I loved that. I quickly made friends in the village, Bible college, and church. A second red flag I ignored. Up at the main mission house, we had a weekly meeting with the head of the mission, Bible college teachers, and other missionaries. I was stirring a cube of sugar into my tea while being introduced to a few people. Christy jumped on me about it, telling me to stop stirring and be more respectful. I was taken aback. We rubbed each other wrong from the start. I judged her because she had no missions experience. While I was only 19, I'd been through 24/7's rigorous training and mission trips and believed I was truly called. At this point, I knew she didn't want to be there. I had a hard time listening to anything she said. She perceived me as a rebellious spirit and felt I needed correction and rebuke. They had, quote, truth talks. They'd call you in if they felt you were out of line or had a bad attitude or said something they didn't approve of, and you had to humbly let them critique and correct you. I have many journals where I raged and struggled inside, clinging to the verse that God's rebuke means he treats you as his own child, clinging to that 24/7 value of submitting to God's authority, especially when you perceive the authority to be imperfect. That's the real test. I postured myself to let them have full access over and influence over my life. I even got in trouble for opening a care package for my mom without asking first, because it was insensitive to the others in the house. I had a crush on Ryan, the director, and fantasized we'd be missionaries together. About a month or so in, though, he got severely sick and had to go home. These young 22-year-olds were thrust into the primary leadership position. They depended on their leader, Gary, who had been the deliverer of God's will for them to be there, even though he was in Colorado. Their leadership style was harsh, which I now perceive was born of insecurity, and they didn't want to be there. I made friends easily, picked up Luganda phrases quickly, learned their songs on my guitar. People stopped by to hang out with me and another student I'd buddied with. We had effortless time making friends in the village and church. In my perception, there was jealousy because my fellow student and I wanted to be there. We felt this was where we were supposed to be, while our leadership had been told to be there and had abandoned their passions. Eventually, my friend and I, after many private talks about our leaderships and competence, were labeled as having a rebellious spirit that we fueled in each other. Meanwhile, I was falling in love with everyone. And let's be honest, I still do. But oh, the beautiful people of Uganda. There was a young woman in the Bible college I was absolutely taken by, and I'm quite sure it was mutual. In that culture, I noticed friends show a lot more physical affection. Still, whenever we saw each other, there was a lot of touch and it felt electric. Christy even jokingly called us out. "Are you guys lesbians or something?" With a laugh. She didn't know about the rainbow I was hiding inside. The Deliverance Conference had not been effective in casting out my sexuality demons, I'll tell you that. There was also a young man in the church who was always on the monthly crusades. Handy, sang, and played keys, loved worship, good at everything, could build anything, a heart for service. I developed the deepest crush, and it was mutual. We talked about it before speaking with leadership, which seems pretty natural. I'd read the book Boundaries in Dating, and I told him we needed leadership approval before spending time together. That any relationship would have to stand the test of leadership and time, and we'd go carefully. Still, we shared some loving notes before bringing it to Christy and Brandon. It unfolded into some silly drama because I withheld from leadership that we'd already talked for fear of being disciplined. I got in trouble for that, even though we'd done nothing wrong and were trying to do it right. Any time together had to be supervised. We still wrote letters. We hung out in groups. I was convinced I'd marry this beautiful Ugandan and make Uganda my home. He made me a beautiful mix CD when I left for Sudan. It felt like a true romance. Side note about crusades. We partnered with the local church on these monthly crusades, and we would pick a village to go visit and spend like 4 to 5 days doing outreach all day from home to home, and then we would have a big service in the evenings. And we would camp together with the local Ugandan church that we partnered with. This was one of my absolute favorite parts of being in Uganda because I got to camp with Ugandans, and there were these grandmas who would make the food out of these massive pots, and we'd have matoke and soup and beans and sit around the fire and laugh until our sides ached. I often tell people that these were the best of times and the worst of times. I experienced some amazing things when I was in Uganda. I got to meet so many people and spend time with people and camp all over the countryside, which was phenomenal and honestly one of my favorite things. And this Ugandan was super adept at survival, like could build anything out there, slaughter a pig, any of that stuff. And I found it to be oh so attractive. So 2 weeks before the end of year internship, when we'd live and serve with missionaries within the larger ministry, I was called into the most brutal truth talk yet and given an ultimatum: be sent home if we didn't change our attitudes. I railed at myself afterwards and felt deeply convicted that I had rebelled against God's authority, that it was a test, that I needed to submit even if they didn't know better than I did about missions. I raked myself over the coals and submitted. Be compliant, don't raise questions, don't be so independent-minded. I got to stay and spend my internship in Sudan with 2 missionaries stationed there. Sudan was what I'd come for. We lived simply, no running water, oven, washer, electricity. We worked alongside our compound employees. I fetched water with them, carrying a 5-gallon jerry can on my head for half a mile, and earning their respect because my heart was truly to live like them and understand their lives. In Sudan, I flourished. I led church, led worship, preached with confidence. At the time, I didn't second-guess myself. I felt confident where I was supposed to be, without over-exact leadership making me question alignment with their expectations. The 2 missionaries I stayed with were so loving and supportive. There was a maize mill a few miles from the compound that the mission had built so people could use it to process their grains and cassava for a fee. We had an employee running it. It took over 2 hours in the Unimog on wild 4x4 jungle roads, if you could call them that, to reach a nearby village to collect several months of cash. We had a guard with an AK-47. We sat in a dark, mud-thatched hut, counting mountains of cash. I had no idea what the money went to. It kind of felt like I was in the mafia. Our guard at the door with his AK-47. We double-counted. I went around the fence for a fast handoff. and Wayne, the missionary, put the cash into my bag discreetly. I climbed into the truck the guard posted. And then the rains came so hard, causing the 12-foot high grass to hang down over the road so we couldn't even see it. And then the brakes went out on the Unimog. Wayne had been a truck driver for years and somehow got us home on steep, muddy roads with no brakes and just using the shifting system. It was incredible. One of the ultimate highlights was getting to know Rose, a compound employee who was also a village midwife and had 5 sons of her own. I wanted to be an OBGYN and deliver babies for Jesus, so I was thrilled to learn her needs and what serving the area was like. She said they desperately needed flashlights. Actual fire torches they used dropped ash onto women's legs or babies' heads during births, and they needed scissors and gloves for cutting umbilical cords. She promised to come get me for an upcoming birth, but the woman didn't go into labor while I was there. Of course, I was sorely disappointed. There was a nearby woman who gave birth to a baby with 2 faces, quote. We raced to the village with a short-term team. They were there to install tile at the compound, to pray for a miracle. By the time we got there, the baby was gone. We prayed for the devastated mother. Looking back, I can imagine the humiliation, being brought out of her home just hours after giving birth, surrounded by 5 men and me right after such trauma. Public emotion isn't common there, and she couldn't hold back her tears. At the time, I took those tears to mean we were ministering to her, that God was pouring love through us. I had no idea. I now shudder at the audacity and the lack of awareness around this situation. Those experiences planted seeds. Our ownership of the mill, trying to intervene in issues bigger than us, learning about the civil war and resource conflict in South Sudan, realizing how professing Jesus as Savior didn't address any practical problems. Tiny seeds of doubt, synonymous with sin to me then, so I pushed them away and chose faith. I wrote in my journal that God has the puzzle pieces and is big enough to help these people find peace and safety at a state level. The compound leader's brother was a Sudan People's Liberation Army general. Hearing him talk was mind-boggling, world-shifting, probably the first seed of, what are we doing here? In Sudan, I had a change of heart about the young man who I had fallen in love with. I convinced myself that we hadn't gone about it right, that I needed to submit to authority, that long distance wasn't realistic since I was headed home, that I didn't know when I was coming back. I remember having a conversation with him when I returned from Sudan. Leadership allowed me to speak to him privately because I told them I felt I needed to end it. Of course he was hurt. The deepest part of me didn't want it to end, but this was one of many times I ignored my own heart in favor of what leadership thought was right for me. I came home on fire from my first stint in Uganda. I painted the self-hate quote across my full-length mirror. God, harden me against myself, the coward with pathetic voice who craves for ease and rest and joy. Myself, arch traitor to myself, my hollowest friend, my deadliest foe, my clog, whatever road I go. I traded my comfortable queen bed for a single mattress and slept under the stars on the roof whenever it was warm enough, so I'd get up easier for morning prayer. I wrestled with what to do next and finally applied to community college for the spring semester. I talked to Christy and Brandon about implementing a second and third-year student leadership model like 24/7 for the discipleship ministry. They didn't seem to take too much interest. While we were there, they had obtained legal guardianship of a little Ugandan girl and even got authorization to bring her back with them to the U.S. She had parents in Uganda. It was a strange situation that reeked of white saviorism. Even though I had a lot of anxiety about starting college, I made a couple friends in chemistry. As lab partners, I felt so much responsibility to share the gospel with them, one of whom I had a deep crush on, surprise. I'm telling you, it's easy for me to fall in love. Plus, I was so deprived of normal college-age interactions. I invited them to see The Passion of the Christ in theaters and proceeded to sob my eyes out. Oh, it must have been pretty awkward. Shane, the lab partner I had a crush on, had just been witnessed to like weeks before we met by Mormon missionaries and decided to convert. He told me he was fed up with his heavy marijuana use, and so he opened his Bible up and asked God to show him the way. He was raised Catholic. And right then the doorbell rang, and it was the Mormon missionaries. He invited me to his church, and I attended, telling myself it was outreach. We started hanging out outside of school. One evening, I went to his house for a meal and Harry Potter. We ended up snuggling. His brother and friends left, and all alone, I gave into my senses and longing and melted into his kiss. Reading my journals from then is just tragic. How awful I felt, like I'd failed, like I'd put my desires over his soul. And yet another part of me was floating. I actually cried because I was so lonely and it felt so good to be held. I was only 20. In addition to witnessing to my classmates, I prayed for my patients at the nursing home where I worked. I literally had the thought about this woman who would come in to visit with old folks and witness to them. Now, she was a Jehovah's Witness, that she was predatory and unethical, completely blind to my own unethical behavior as an employee witnessing to my own patients. Wow. Sometime during the semester, I got an unexpected call from Christy and Brandon asking me to come back as a second-year student leader. I was shocked. We talked about my role. I wanted to implement an exercise program as a part of the discipleship program. I got the go-ahead. I was excited to return, and of course, I wondered if I was doing the right thing. I didn't want to put my education on the back burner, and I thought maybe I'll be back to school by fall. I prepared to leave right after finals. The second trip was different. I felt the weight of leadership. I felt I had to really submit to God's authority and not mess it up this time. I had to be an example for the first-year students. I wanted God to know I would go straight into missions without an education, if that's what he wanted for my life. And that's when I started, on a deeper level, to experience psychological abuse. Christy and Brandon weren't allowed to think for themselves either. Their leader, Gary, the one who helped develop the program and put them in charge, would literally rewrite their support letters to their own family and friends. He was very controlling over the details of their life under the guise of discipleship. That was the leadership style they reproduced. Christy was an only child raised by a single mother and her grandma. I came from a large family, 4 siblings, parents still together. They sent me care packages and cards. I got emails from family and friends regularly. It became a point of contention. I noticed jealousy of my best friend in particular. She would find things about her to criticize. There was another care package incident. My mom had sent homemade granola, Cholula, and green Tabasco. No such sauces in Uganda, a total treat. I was guilted into sharing, accused of being selfish for wanting to make these treats last. I noticed Christy demanding a certain level of intimacy and friendship, and then publicly shaming and disciplining me for acting too casually with her in front of others. She was 23 and so young. Brandon seemed pretty lost. He would just jump on whatever Christy was harping on. As I mentioned earlier, we had these truth talks, where they would dissect what you did and said. I started aligning with their thinking out of guilt, trying to make decisions I thought they'd approve of. My behavior was scrutinized down to how I put cover up on my face. I couldn't see it at the time. They were miserable, didn't want to be there, and were envious of my family relationships, close friends, and how quickly I made deep connections with Ugandans through music, language, and my genuine desire to be there. I remember a specific incident when the power went out, as it regularly did. As a second-year student, I had earned my own room and had brought a few cozy things from home, like candles, throw pillows, a few magazine cutouts to hang up, to make it feel like my own little cozy space. Christy demanded I bring out my candles to light for everyone. I protested. We all had headlamps. We didn't need candles. She made a big scene about defying authority and being selfish, so I brought them out. I wanted to preserve them. They were decorative. They were mine. My cheeks burned hot. My heart was screaming, "This is ridiculous." And I shoved it down. It might seem silly, but that was a pivotal moment of choosing their approval. It only increased from there. My mom visited us in Uganda during that second year and saw red flags, but Christy and Brandon wouldn't let her speak to anything. She was used to being spiritual authority in my life, and I felt I was breaking free from that. I framed her concerns as her not respecting me leaving the nest. I wouldn't hear it. I'm so proud of my mom for making that trip. It was huge for her, and I can't imagine how excruciating it must have been to see the dysfunction only to be completely tuned out. On that second stint, I really started to become the third leg of their marriage, which was unstable and unhealthy. They'd been pressured to marry at 19 by spiritual authority and pressured into this assignment. It became easier for them to focus on me, what was wrong with me, especially while they had to play the role of the perfect Christian couple in front of the first-year students. I was pulled deep into their relationship in unhealthy ways. Christy demanded intimacy, confided about the issues they were having, then punished me for it later. During the years when you're supposed to develop independent thinking and begin mapping your own life, I reverted to looking to two people only a couple years older than me for approval on every decision. They taught that God chooses his mouthpiece and it's your job to submit to the authority he's placed in your life, even if that leader is imperfect. My guitar playing and worship leading became a point of contention. I was accused of squandering my gifts. I started to become fearful of stepping out, which invited more scrutiny. I developed deep self-loathing, and I remember wanting to just burn my guitar and toss it all out the window. One time I did stand up was on a trip to the north to witness to the Karamojong, an extraordinary experience received with hospitality, dancing, and ceremony. We were under two massive trees witnessing to the village when a huge rainstorm hit. Christy was preaching and praying that we would not be rained upon. The rains came. My guitar bag lay half under the canopy of trees and half out. Under the canopy, dry. Outside the canopy, wet. Christy and Brandon wrote in their newsletter that God miraculously kept us dry, no mention of the tree. I pointed out the tree. She accused me of giving glory to the tree and robbing it from God. They insisted I include it as a miracle in my newsletter, too. I caved and felt sick. More little betrayals of myself that warped my mind. Anxiety and self-doubt increased. I waffled about what to do after the service term. There was weird matchmaking activity, an intrusive interest in my love life, demanding details, demanding to read my journals. Their leader, Gary, set me up with someone who visited on a short-term mission. He ended up pursuing someone else without telling me. Awkward and bizarre. Honestly, I was falling in love with all of the Ugandans and would rather have married one and disappeared into the countryside. It felt like Christy was fantasizing possibilities through me because she felt trapped. I understand that now. Even so, I came back from the second trip with some sense of self still intact, and I wanted to pursue an education. I applied to Western State as a pre-med student, received a transfer scholarship, toured campus with my parents, applied to be an RA, had a friend and church there. I was so excited. Christy and Brandon did their best to convince me that a secular school was a lion's den and I wasn't ready, that I needed another year of discipleship in Uganda. After the second trip, there was a major falling out between Christy and Brandon and their leader, Gary, and he ended up withdrawing his support. They still got clearance from the head of the ministry in Uganda to continue to run the discipleship program and were desperate for me to come back. Gary called me and tried to talk me out of it. My loyalty ran deep. The red flags were obvious, but the damage in my psyche was done. I abandoned university plans and went back for a third year. We went a month early to prepare and find a bigger house for the amount of students arriving. I lived with them and the little Ugandan girl they had guardianship over. The fighting between them was constant. I witnessed violence toward this little girl and violence between the two of them. Christy came to me one night crying after being thrown against the wall and locked out of their room. I thought, I should get out of here. But I didn't. This is God's will. These are God's leaders. I'm here to serve. When the students arrived, they shifted their focus back to me as the third leg of their unstable stool. They tore me apart. I grew visibly afraid of doing or saying the wrong thing.
less confident in worship, leading, and guitar. They doubled down, more truth talks, more telling me I was squandering God's gifts and destiny, and that they were shamed to have me represent the discipleship ministry. They even eventually demoted me from assistant director back down to a first-year student and moved me into the dorm room with the other first-year girls, giving my private room to the new second year, publicly disciplining me, holding truth talks in front of others, and eventually sending me to live with a neighboring pastor's family. This is from one of the truth talks in my journal. Just stop. It's a sin not to operate in the authority God has given you. Then you lead worship just because you can, and you minister out of your own strength. You have the potential to change the atmosphere in a room, to lead people into the presence of God, but you refuse to walk in the authority God gives you to do it with boldness. So your worship is weak. You quench God's spirit. You're not leading people anywhere you're supposed to be. Grow up. Own a conversation. Own your facial expressions. Lead the conversation. End the conversation. God hasn't given up on you, so get up. They accused me of being a chameleon, trying to guess what they wanted. They could see what was happening and loathed it, yet were stuck in this cycle of cutting me down every time I tried any other way. I couldn't win. Stand up for myself or guess their wishes. Either way, I was wrong. Another journal entry. I cannot believe I'm still fighting some of these things. I'm fighting. I feel like such an idiot. Oh, how I loathe my chameleon-like behavior. I have this overwhelming desire to get the heck out of here right now. Sometime after, I was convinced to stop talking to my parents because they were, quote, using their financial support to sway my decisions. I wanted to hone in on what God was telling me without their influence, aka legit concerns. My parents and sisters were beyond concerned. I can't imagine what it was like for them, how painful that was. The head of the ministry came down to speak with us, and I parroted that my parents were using financial support to control my decisions. There wasn't much they could do. Several weeks later, another couple in leadership offered me a way out. They offered, maybe God is pulling twigs from the nest so you'll fly. They gave me options within the mission, and Christy and Brandon had no authority to make this decision for me. I still chose to stay. When the students left, Christy and I didn't know what we'd do. By then, I'd convinced myself I didn't even like missions. I was dressing like Christy, doing my hair and makeup like hers. I became her double. She clutched me close and hated me for reflecting her. We decided to stay through the holidays while the whole mission returned home. Brandon went back, offered his old job. We dreamed of volunteering at a baby home in town, promoting adoptions. I'd written them a song. We met a filmmaker. None of it came to fruition. In reality, it became us living our best life on the remaining donations and money I'd saved, getting to help out at a baby home throughout the week, and then hanging out at the American Recreation Association to work out and swim at the pool. Sometime during this third year, Christy met an older hairdresser and expat from India. I'll call him Raj, who saw her vulnerability and sank his claws in deep. She called it witnessing. The first couple of visits, I went along. Once we even stayed at his house because political unrest made it unsafe to drive home at night, and we weren't supposed to be driving at night anyways. She then started dropping me off at Garden City Mall, downtown Kampala, in the evening. Sometimes I'd be there until close or even after. This was a bizarre time. I made friends with employees and eventually met a young man from Lebanon named Ahmed. He and I started spending this time together. Meanwhile, cracks in my worldview were widening. I'd read the Bible cover to cover multiple times and began really questioning the whole thing. I started recognizing colonialism under the guise of missions and the dissonance between the teachings of Jesus and what was being done on the mission field here. Being there long term, I saw the effects. White people with zero accountability. I myself even pulled teeth. A 20-year-old nurse's aide in a dental clinic run by an American nurse who was trained in the field. The lack of accountability and the legacy that white people know better, especially in the villages. Short-term teams giving candy to malnourished kids, taking selfies, feeling self-sacrificial for coming all the way to Africa to serve, and then getting the accolades back at home. Medical teams coming and doing major surgeries without the appropriate equipment and aftercare. Uganda showed me collectivism, community, hospitality. People had time for one another. The only culture shock I experienced was when I came home to our individualistic consumer culture. It all started to crack my worldview. After a brutal year where I'd become like a browbeaten puppy, a part of me believed I'd failed the mission and failed God, that I'd truly failed the passion and dream I'd carried, and then convinced myself maybe I never liked it in the first place. With all that swirling, I thought, screw it, I just want to be a real person. Here's a journal entry from those last weeks in Uganda, hanging out in the rooftop restaurant at the mall in Kampala. I am just enjoying being out of the bubble, saying what I want to say, not racking my brain, trying to think of what Christy would say, not being who I think people demand me and want me to be. No expectations, just being me. Saying what I want to say, what's true, not what I think should be true of myself, just what's true. It's so shockingly refreshing to say what is really inside me. I had 2 nights left in Uganda. Christy invited me to a fancy party with Raj, but I wasn't invited to dinner afterwards. So I made arrangements with Ahmad, who picked me up with 4 other dudes in the car. They were going to drop us at a restaurant and borrow Ahmad's car to pick up one of their dads from the airport, and they did exactly that. I had made a flash decision while Ahmad and I were at dinner that since I was a failure and fucked everything up, I might as well go all the way and enjoy the connection I had with this young man. I convinced Ahmad to get us a little hostel. We made out the whole entire taxi ride. In the hotel, things got hot and heavy. Shirt off, he started to unbutton my pants. The connection was intoxicating. I had felt so alone for so long. And then I freaked out. He sat back and said, "Hey, don't worry. We don't have to do anything. Not everything is about sex. You want some soda?" So we watched TV and drank Cokes, sitting in the bed. Another crack in my worldview. Here was someone from the Middle East, not a Christian, loosely Muslim even, not trying to victimize me. I'd never been taught boundaries and consent, and witnessing it rocked me. As we sat there with our Cokes, my phone started buzzing. It was Christy. I decided to ignore it until the 4th call. She was in hysterics. "He's trying to kill me. He's trying to kill me." I coached her to try to get out of Raj's compound and told her that Ahmad and I were on our way. We ran out to the street and tried to find a taxi, but it was 2 a.m. We finally found a boda boda, which is a little moped taxi, and managed to both fit on the back. With all 3 of us on this thing, it could barely get up the hills. I was on the phone with Christy the entire time. She managed to escape the compound. I could hear him yelling after her. I instructed her to get to a neighbor's house and ask for help. On the way, we came across a car taxi and snagged that, racing to this man's house. Meanwhile, Christy had found refuge with one of the neighbors, and then I could hear Raj yelling in the background. He was threatening the neighbors, accusing them of kidnapping his wife, and that he had friends in the police force and was going to come after them. He got in his car and raced off. At this point, the night guard for the Ugandan household started treating Christy like a prisoner, demanding she empty her purse so he could search it. He wasn't going to let her go. We finally arrived. I got up in that guard's face. The family was arguing with me. Christy was crying. It was a mess. Then Ahmad intervened, claiming to be Christy's brother, giving the family his cell phone number. "Please call me if you have any trouble with Raj." He managed to defuse the situation. The guard let Christy come with us. Ahmad dropped us off at the hostel where Christy and I stayed the night. Raj called at least 50 times, at least, and sent threats via text to both of us through the night. He of course knew where we lived. In the morning light, I could see the bruise developing on Christy's face. He had assaulted her. She didn't tell me what led up to this violence, and I still don't know exactly what happened. I remember thinking as we ate our little hostel breakfast, what happened to us? Ahmad came back in the morning. He had his car back from his friend, so he drove us home and paid for the hostel. I will never forget his kindness and the respect that he showed me that night, and I'll never forget the feeling of the illusion cracking. the illusion that Christy was a leader in my life. I finally saw that she was lost and so vulnerable, with no idea what she was doing. Ironically, my initial perception back when I first arrived. Full of anxiety, we packed up our stuff as quickly as we could, looking over our shoulders with quickened breath. We spent our last night in Uganda with a friend. We were afraid to be at the house. We made it out in time with expired visas and threats of violence to our physical safety from Raj, who even vowed to show up at the airport. We were both deeply shaken. I came home not knowing how things would land with my parents. I hadn't spoken to them. I felt so lost. My family, including my parents, met me at the airport with open arms. I made it home, stunned, numb, and staring down the beginning of my deconstruction journey.
Don't walk away. Don't run from the pain. Trust you'll be safe. 'Cause you're